Hello, and welcome to some Dodge family history. This is where I present information and research on my ancestors who served in the military during the early 20th century. Today, I will be presenting on the military service of Private David Nemetzky, Troop A, 7th Cavalry. This presentation will use records that are available on Family Search, such as cavalry troop and post returns, and name and subject indexed correspondence of the Adjutant General's office, as well as National Archives records, such as enlistment papers, medical records, Adjutant General's office correspondence, and court-martial records, to tell the story of the early days of his military service. David Nemetzky served in the Army from 1904 to 1931. He is my great-great-uncle and married my great-great-aunt, Frances Cleveland Dodge, in 1930 in San Francisco. Their photograph, taken in 1936, is on the right. David Nemetzky was born in Warsaw, Poland, then Russia, during the 1880s. Depending on which record you consult, his year of birth varies from as early as 1881 to as late as 1890. He was the son of Herman, or Hyman, Nemetzky, and Betsy, or Bessie, Lubert. According to his father's citizenship application, his father arrived at New York City on March 15, 1888, and was sworn in as a U.S. citizen on August 2, 1899. David Nemetzky's family lived at 53 Suffolk Street in Manhattan's Lower East Side. A picture of the apartment building from New York City tax photos collection taken in 1940 is seen here on the left. In January of 1904, various New York City newspapers published the following advertisement. Able-bodied unmarried men between ages of 21 and 35, citizens of United States, of good character and temperate habits, who can speak, read, and write English. For information, apply to Recruiting Office, 25 3rd Avenue, 2360 3rd Avenue, 705 6th Avenue, New York, or 363 Fulton Street, Brooklyn. It is likely that David Nemetzky saw this advertisement in the newspaper and decided to enlist in the U.S. Army. He enlisted on January 14, 1904, at 705 6th Avenue in New York. His enlistment papers, housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., include his descriptive and assignment card and indicate that he was 22 years and 8 months of age, placing his month and year of birth as May of 1881, and worked as a salesman. He was 5 feet 3 1/2 inches tall, had blue eyes and black hair. He listed his father, Herman Nemetzky, who was living at 53 Suffolk Street, as his next of kin. He also stated that he had made legal declaration to become a U.S. citizen. David Nemetzky's citizenship record has not been located. His term of enlistment was for 3 years. Following his enlistment, he was sent to Fort Slocum, New York, which is on David's Island in Long Island Sound, off the shore from the town of New Rochelle, New York. According to the monthly return for Fort Slocum from January of 1904, he was one of 90 recruits who arrived there that month and who were assigned to the cavalry. On February 9, 1904, he, along with more than 60 other recruits, were transferred from Fort Slocum, New York, to Camp George H. Thomas at Chickamauga National Park in Georgia, next to where Fort Oglethorpe is today and is about 20 miles from Chattanooga, Tennessee. The monthly return from the 7th Cavalry from February 1904 records that he was received there on February 11, 1904, and assigned to Troop A, 7th Cavalry. His military service did not get off to an auspicious start. Carded medical records housed at the National Archives of Washington, D.C. record the following. On March 1, 1904, he suffered a simple fracture to the 9th right rib, which was the result of being kicked by a horse in camp. He spent 15 days in the camp hospital and returned to duty on March 16th. 2 days later, on March 18th, he was readmitted for acute lumbago, lower back pain, no doubt related to the injury he suffered from being kicked by a horse, and remained hospitalized until the end of the month. On April 5th, he suffered a sprained right wrist after falling off another horse during drill the previous day. He was released back to duty on April 6th. On April 13th, he was readmitted for the same injury and was hospitalized for 2 more days, returning again to duty on April 15th. It was at this point that he decided he had enough. The monthly return for the 7th Cavalry from April of 1904 indicates that David Nemetzky, Private, Troop A, deserted on April 17th. He made his way to New Orleans, Louisiana, a distance of some 600 miles, before surrendering to civil authorities on May 21st, as indicated on the monthly return for the 7th Cavalry from May of 1904. He was turned over to military authorities and imprisoned at Jackson Barracks, Louisiana. According to the monthly post returns for Jackson Barracks for May and June of 1904, Private Nemetzky was charged with desertion and imprisoned there from May 22nd until June 17, 1904. According to the post return for Jackson Barracks from June of 1904, he was transferred back to Camp Thomas, Georgia on the 17th. On June 23, 1904, Private David Nemetzky was tried by General Court Martial at Camp Thomas. The transcript of the General Court Martial is housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Private Nemetzky faced one charge of desertion. The specification reads, Private David Nemetzky, Troop A, 7th Cavalry, a soldier in the service of the United States, did desert the same at Camp George H. Thomas, Georgia, on or around the 17th day of April, 1904, and did remain absent in desertion until he, Private David Nemetzky, Troop A, 7th Cavalry, did surrender himself at New Orleans, Louisiana, on or about the 21st day of May, 1904. He pled not guilty to the charge of desertion, but stated he was guilty to being absent without leave. First Sergeant Edward Davis, who was called to testify for the prosecution, stated that Private Nemetzky absented himself from his troop on or about April 17, 1904, and that he arrived back at Camp Thomas on June 18th. First Sergeant Davis testified that he took an inventory of Private Nemetzky's belongings on April 18th and found that his uniform, handbook, several rounds of .30 caliber ball ammunition, socks, and other military items were left in his locker. The first sergeant stated that he believed that Private Nemetzky had deserted after looking in his locker and finding his military items still there, but finding that other personal apparel and items were missing. The first sergeant stated that Private Nemetzky was of good character and had never expressed any dissatisfaction or intention to desert. The next witness for the prosecution was Private David W. White, who had enlisted on January 22, 1904 from Alabama and was assigned to Troop A on February 10th. He explained that on the evening of April 17th, he saw Private Nemetzky heading towards the canteen around 6:30 p.m., dressed in a blue overcoat and forage cap. He stated the next time he saw Private Nemetzky was following his return to camp on June 18th. Perhaps in a remark meant to lend to his defense, Private White indicated that Private Nemetzky was absent without leave instead of stating that he had deserted. The next witness for the prosecution was Captain and Adjutant Edward D. Anderson. He took the following statement from Private Nemetzky following his return to camp on June 18th. Left troop without leave about April 15th. Went to Chattanooga, from there to Atlanta, thence to Montgomery, Alabama, from there to Mobile, and thence to New Orleans. Surrendered to Sergeant of Police in New Orleans Saturday night 4 weeks ago, and has been confined as a prisoner at Jackson Barracks since that time. Was disgusted with the service and everything at the time he went away. Had been in the hospital most of the time. Did not intend to desert, but was going to return. Left camp in uniform, put on civilian clothes in Chattanooga, and was in civilian clothes when surrendered to police in New Orleans. Did not dispose of any of his property, but left everything intact when he went away. Captain Anderson also testified of the following event which occurred during the return of Private Nemetzky back to Camp Thomas. The sergeant from Jackson Barracks, in charge of the prisoner who brought this man, Private Nemetzky, from Jackson Barracks to this post, had a man by the name of Campbell with him as a guard. Campbell got drunk just before reaching Newman, Georgia, created a great deal of disturbance in the car, threatened to shoot the sergeant and to desert. The sergeant turned him over to civil authorities at Newman, Georgia, and he was confined. The sergeant reported that Nemetzky had behaved himself in a very quiet manner and proper manner during the disorder, and in that way had assisted materially in disposing of this man Campbell, and desired especially to commend the accused for his good conduct during the time. Second Lieutenant James A. Shannon was called to testify for the defense. On the left is a photograph of Lieutenant Shannon. He was appointed second lieutenant on June 11, 1903, and worked his way up the ranks, attaining the rank of lieutenant colonel during World War I. Lieutenant Colonel Shannon was killed in action in World War I in October of 1918 and is buried at Arlington. Lieutenant Shannon explained that Private Nemetzky always appeared to try to do his duty very well. I drilled him as a recruit. He seemed to have a great deal of difficulty in learning to ride. He seemed to try very hard to learn to ride, but did not get along very well, and was several times thrown very badly. He was kicked in the riding hall one day and had to go to the hospital and stayed there some time. I saw him thrown twice at drill on the plain in one day. The last time he was thrown against a tree and seemed to be pretty badly hurt. Lieutenant Shannon also explained that Private Nemetzky had usually trained with different, but mostly well-behaved horses, but was injured every time he had been given a difficult horse to train with. Private Jackson Wright also testified in Private Nemetzky's defense. Private Wright was also newly enlisted, having joined up January 30th, 1904, and assigned to the 7th Cavalry on February 10th. Private Wright testified. He, Private Nemetzky, was not treated like the rest of us. At one time he was thrown from his horse and Sergeant Davis threatened to strike him. This was just after he came out of the hospital, and it was impossible for him to sit on the horse he had, as he was very rough. He fell off and Sergeant Davis told him to mount again, and he replied that it was impossible for him to do so, and he could take him to the guardhouse first. The sergeant called him lots of names and cursed him. When he went in hospital, the sergeant said he hoped he'd die and told him he would make life miserable for him in the troop. Private David Nemetzky then testified on his own behalf. When asked about what happened to his uniform, he explained that he had been given a set of civilian clothes in Chattanooga by an individual who was of the same nationality as he. He made the following statement, which was admitted at the General Court Martial while imprisoned at Jackson Barracks on May 23, 1904. I left my troop sometime in April. I was excused from check, but had no pass. I went to several places. After I left, first I went to Chattanooga, Atlanta, Montgomery, Mobile, and then I came to New Orleans. I tried to work several times, but I got too weak to work. I was only 2 days in New Orleans when I surrendered. I had a good many accidents to occur to me. I was sick in hospital most of the time. I asked several people to be transferred from cavalry to infantry. I asked the first sergeant, also I asked the clerk, and I asked several soldiers, but all told me there was no chance of it. The surgeon asked me if I would like to go to the infantry, and I said I would like to go. I was unable to learn to ride. That was the reason I left the troop. I tried to bear it as long as I could, but every time I tried to get on a horse an accident occurred to me. I had had no other reason for leaving. I had no fault to find with anybody. Everybody treated me the best way possible. I left this post in my uniform and left the uniform in Chattanooga and wore citizen's clothes after that. Following the testimonies of the witnesses and the testimony and statement of David Nemetzky, he was found guilty of desertion. His sentence was to be dishonorably discharged from the service of the United States, forfeiting all pay and allowances due him, and to be confined at hard labor at such post as the receiving authority shall direct for 6 months. However, the court unanimously, respectfully recommends that clemency be extended by the reviewing authority. This recommendation is made because the evident good character of Private Nemetzky while serving as a soldier of this post, and because it is believed by these members of the court that this soldier was driven to desert on account of his inability to learn to ride a horse and the hardships resulting from this inability, and not from any desire to shirk his duty. On July 2, 1904, the reviewing authority agreed with the court's unanimous recommendation and granted clemency. The sentence was reduced to 2 months hard labor at Camp Thomas and forfeiture of $10 per month for those 2 months. The reviewing authority also noted that they would give favorable consideration to the request from Private Nemetzky for transfer from the cavalry to the Coast Artillery. The name and subject index to correspondence of the Adjutant General's office indicate that on July 7, 1904, he requested transfer to the Coast Artillery Corps, stating that it was for the good of the service. The correspondence of the Adjutant General's office is housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The third endorsement of his request, dated July 12, 1904, recommended he be transferred to the 99th Company of the Coast Artillery Corps, as his company had the least strength of numbers at that time. His transfer was approved and the order was issued on July 26, 1904. Following completion of his sentence and release from confinement on September 10, 1904, he was transferred to the 99th Company of the Coast Artillery Corps, stationed at Fort Morgan, Alabama. He arrived there on September 14, 1904. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation and found it informative. The first several months of Private Nemetzky's military service were full of turmoil and strife, as shown by the available records that are found online at Family Search, as well as of records housed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The next presentation will look at Private Nemetzky's service in the Coast Artillery Corps and include additional records from Family Search and the National Archives. Thank you.